June 6, 1944. 00:30 hours. Normandy, France. The sound begins as a distant rumble, like thunder rolling across the English Channel on a clear night. But this is no storm. Obergefreiter Hans Weber, manning his observation post in the concrete bunker overlooking the Norman coastline, lifts his head from his field telephone. The noise grows louder, a deep mechanical drone that seems to fill the entire sky. Above the darkened fields of the Cotentin Peninsula, over the ancient hedgerows of Calvados, and across the sleeping villages of Normandy, nearly 1,200 Allied transport aircraft and gliders are crossing into German-occupied Europe. Inside their bellies, 24,000 paratroopers sit in tense silence, their faces blackened with camouflage paint, their gear checked and rechecked. 3 entire airborne divisions, the British 6th, the American 82nd, and the 101st, are about to land behind German lines in the largest nighttime military operation in human history. Weber reaches for his field glasses, scanning the star-filled sky. What he sees defies comprehension. Formations of aircraft stretching from horizon to horizon, their navigation lights creating a constellation of war. The young German soldier has witnessed bombing raids before, but this is different. This feels like the entire Allied Air Force has come to France. In less than 6 hours, German field commanders will be frantically calling Berlin with reports that seem impossible. Entire Allied armies have appeared overnight behind their coastal defenses. The war has taken a turn that no military academy had prepared them for. For 4 long years, German forces had dominated Western Europe with what seemed like invincible efficiency. After crushing France in a mere 6 weeks during 1940, Adolf Hitler's Wehrmacht had transformed the entire Atlantic coastline into a fortress of concrete and steel, the Atlantic Wall Stress, issued over 1,600 miles from Norway's fjords to the Spanish border, bristling with artillery pieces, machine gun nests, and tank traps designed to throw any invasion force back into the sea. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, had spent months racing along this coastal barrier, inspecting every bunker, every gun emplacement, every strand of barbed wire. His sharp eyes missed nothing as he demanded more mines, stronger fortifications, and deadlier obstacles scattered across the beaches where Allied soldiers might dare to land. By spring of 1944, Rommel had overseen the placement of over 6 million mines along the Norman coast alone, turning peaceful fishing villages into death traps of explosive steel. The German High Command knew the invasion was coming. British and American forces had been massing in England for months, their preparations impossible to hide completely despite elaborate deception operations. Every German intelligence report painted the same picture. A massive amphibious assault was imminent, most likely targeting the Pas-de-Calais region where the English Channel was narrowest. Wehrmacht planners had positioned their strongest divisions there, confident they could predict where the Allies would strike. But the Germans had made their calculations based on traditional military thinking. Throughout history, armies crossed water at the shortest possible distance, landed on the most suitable beaches, and advanced along the most direct routes to their objectives. This logic had guided warfare for centuries, from Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon to Napoleon's campaigns across European rivers. The German defensive strategy relied entirely on this predictable approach. What the Wehrmacht leadership failed to anticipate was the revolutionary scale of Allied airborne capabilities. Previous paratrooper operations had been limited affairs, a few hundred men dropped behind enemy lines to seize a bridge or destroy a communications center. The Germans themselves had pioneered large-scale airborne assault during their conquest of Crete in 1941, but even that operation involved only 14,000 paratroopers spread across several days. The idea of landing 3 entire divisions simultaneously, in darkness, across a front of nearly 50 miles, seemed beyond the realm of military possibility. German defensive preparations focused almost exclusively on repelling seaborne invasion. Coastal artillery zeroed in on likely landing beaches, underwater obstacles designed to rip apart landing craft, and concrete bunkers positioned to create devastating crossfire against troops struggling ashore through surf and sand. Infantry divisions practiced rushing from inland positions to reinforce coastal strongpoints the moment Allied ships appeared on the horizon. Panzer divisions held themselves ready to counterattack once the invasion's main thrust became clear. This coastal-focused mindset extended throughout the German command structure. Intelligence officers studied tide tables and weather patterns, trying to predict the optimal conditions for amphibious assault. Reconnaissance flights over southern England photographed landing craft concentrations and troop movements, all focused on detecting preparations for a cross-channel attack. Radio intercept stations monitored Allied communications, listening for clues about invasion timing and target beaches. Yet for all their meticulous planning, German commanders had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the coming assault. They envisioned a traditional invasion, ships approaching visible on the horizon, naval, bombardment announcing the attack's beginning, and Allied troops fighting their way inland from established beachheads. This conventional thinking would prove catastrophically inadequate when faced with an operation that turned military doctrine on its head. The Atlantic Wall's designers had created a defensive system perfectly suited to repelling the last war's invasion methods, but utterly unprepared for the revolutionary approach the Allies were about to unleash. In less than 24 hours, this fundamental miscalculation would transform confident German defenders into desperate men pleading with Berlin for permission to negotiate their way out of an impossible situation. Across the English Channel, the Allied war machine had spent 2 years preparing for an operation unlike anything attempted in military history. Operation Neptune, the assault phase of the broader Operation Overlord, represented the largest seaborne invasion ever planned, but its most revolutionary element was the airborne component that would precede the beach landings by several crucial hours. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, understood that traditional amphibious assault doctrine faced a fundamental problem. Attacking forces were most vulnerable during their initial moments ashore when they lacked heavy weapons, secure communications, and room to maneuver. Previous Allied landings in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy had succeeded, but only after accepting heavy casualties during the critical first hours when German defenders held every advantage. The solution developed by Allied planners was audacious in its scope and unprecedented in its execution. Instead of simply landing on beaches and fighting inland, the Allies would simultaneously drop 3 entire airborne divisions behind German coastal defenses under cover of darkness. These paratroopers and glider-borne infantry would seize key objectives, disrupt German communications, and create chaos in the enemy rear areas just as seaborne forces hit the beaches at dawn. The scale of this airborne armada defied previous military experience. The British 6th Airborne Division, commanded by Major General Richard Gale, would drop east of the invasion beaches to secure the Allied left flank and prevent German reinforcements from reaching the landing zones. Their objectives included capturing intact the bridges over the Caen Canal and Orne River, destroying coastal artillery batteries that could devastate the beach landings, and establishing a defensive perimeter to hold against inevitable counterattacks. On the invasion's western flank, 2 American airborne divisions would tackle equally critical missions. The 82nd Airborne Division, veterans of combat jumps in Sicily and Italy, would seize the town of Sainte-Mère-Église and secure crossings over the Meurthe River. Meanwhile, the 101st Airborne Division, making their combat debut, would capture causeway exits behind Utah Beach and link up with seaborne forces advancing inland from the coast. Together, these 3 divisions comprised nearly 24,000 paratroopers and glider infantry, supported by over 1,200 transport aircraft and hundreds of gliders. The logistics of coordinating such an operation staggered even experienced military planners. Pathfinder teams would jump first, landing in complete darkness to set up navigation beacons for the main force. Transport pilots would navigate without radio communication, relying on dead reckoning and visual landmarks to find their drop zones in hostile territory. Each paratrooper carried between 60 and 100 pounds of equipment, including weapons, ammunition, rations, medical supplies, and specialized gear for their individual missions. Many also carried folding bicycles, radio sets, or demolition charges. Some unfortunate soldiers bore the additional burden of mortar base plates or machine gun tripods strapped to their legs. The physical challenge of jumping with such loads, then fighting immediately upon landing, would test human endurance to its limits. The timing of the airborne drops was calculated with mathematical precision. Paratroopers needed to land early enough to secure their objectives before German reinforcements could react, but not so early that they would exhaust their limited ammunition and supplies before seaborne forces arrived. Weather conditions had to provide enough visibility for navigation while maintaining cloud cover to conceal the transport formations from German night fighters. Most critically, the airborne assault had to achieve tactical surprise on a scale never before attempted. German radar stations could track large aircraft formations, but Allied intelligence hoped the enemy would assume they were observing another bombing raid until too late. The success of the entire invasion depended on German commanders remaining confused about Allied intentions during the crucial first hours of June 6th. This revolutionary approach to amphibious warfare represented more than tactical innovation. It embodied a fundamental shift in military thinking. Previous invasions had accepted the disadvantage of attacking heavily defended positions from the sea. Operation Neptune would instead surround those defenses, striking simultaneously from sea, land, and air in a coordinated assault that would overwhelm German defensive capabilities through sheer audacity and unprecedented scale. The technological marvel of landing entire armies overnight represented a quantum leap in military capability that few German officers could immediately comprehend. When the first reports reached Wehrmacht command posts in the early morning hours of June 6th, many experienced commanders initially dismissed them as exaggerated accounts from panicked sentries. The idea that the Allies possessed the logistical capacity to transport, navigate, and deploy 24,000 combat troops in a single nighttime operation seemed to violate every principle of military possibility. German military doctrine had evolved from centuries of European warfare where armies moved at the speed of marching men and horse-drawn artillery. Even the revolutionary blitzkrieg tactics that had conquered Poland and France relied on mechanized forces advancing along predictable routes toward geographical objectives. The concept of bypassing defensive lines entirely by dropping fully equipped divisions behind enemy positions challenged fundamental assumptions about how wars were fought. From a purely technical perspective, the Allied achievement bordered on miraculous. Coordinating over 1,200 aircraft in darkness without radio communication across a front spanning nearly 50 miles required navigation skills and timing precision that pushed 1940s technology to its absolute limits. Each transport pilot had to locate his specific drop zone using only compass headings, elapsed time calculations, and visual recognition of terrain features barely visible in starlight. The paratroopers themselves represented a new breed of soldier that German commanders struggled to categorize. These men combined the mobility of cavalry, the firepower of infantry, and the shock value of surprise attack in ways that existing military doctrine couldn't adequately address. They carried enough ammunition and supplies to operate independently for several days, yet possessed the training and equipment to assault fortified positions immediately upon landing. Even more unsettling from the German perspective was the industrial capacity that such an operation revealed. The Allied war machine had not only produced over 1,000 transport aircraft and hundreds of gliders, but had also trained tens of thousands of air crews and paratroopers to execute this complex mission. The implications were staggering. If the Allies could mount one operation of this scale, how many more might follow? German tactical responses proved inadequate because their defensive planning had assumed conventional attack patterns. Coastal fortifications faced seaward, with limited capability to engage targets approaching from inland directions. Artillery batteries positioned to devastate beach landings found themselves under attack from paratroopers who had simply bypassed the killing zones entirely. Communication networks designed to coordinate responses to amphibious assault became targets for demolition teams that had materialized behind German lines like ghosts. The psychological impact proved equally devastating. German soldiers had grown accustomed to fighting enemies who announced their presence through obvious preparations, massing tanks, concentrating artillery, or building up supplies for offensive operations. The overnight appearance of Allied forces violated this predictable pattern, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty that undermined German confidence in their defensive advantages. For veteran Wehrmacht officers who had studied military history and warfare theory, the Allied airborne assault represented something unprecedented in human conflict. Alexander the Great had never faced enemies who could appear behind his formations without crossing the intervening terrain. Napoleon's campaigns offered no guidance for dealing with opponents who materialized from the sky. Even recent German innovations like paratrooper assaults and glider landings paled in comparison to the scale and coordination of Operation Neptune's airborne component. This technological and tactical revolution created a crisis of understanding within German command structures. Traditional military responses, concentrate reserves, establish defensive lines, coordinate counterattacks, all assume knowledge of enemy positions and intentions. When entire Allied divisions could appear anywhere behind German lines with minimal warning, such conventional wisdom became dangerously obsolete. The speed of the Allied deployment also negated many German advantages. Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized rapid response and concentrated firepower to defeat enemy forces piecemeal before they could consolidate their positions. But when three full divisions landed simultaneously across a 50-mile front, German reserves faced the impossible task of responding to multiple major threats at once, each requiring immediate attention to prevent disaster. The human dimension of the German command crisis revealed itself most starkly in the communication breakdowns that paralyzed Wehrmacht response during the critical first hours of June 6. As reports flooded into command posts from across Normandy, describing paratroopers landing everywhere from Carentan to Caen, experienced German officers found themselves facing a nightmare scenario that no amount of training or combat experience had prepared them for. General Erich Marx, commanding the LX-Spy 4th Corps responsible for defending much of the Normandy coast, received his first reports of airborne landings at approximately 01:30 hours. A methodical officer who had lost a leg fighting in Russia, Marx initially treated these accounts with the skepticism of a veteran commander accustomed to exaggerated battlefield reports. Single paratroopers or small sabotage teams were certainly possible. The Allies had conducted such operations before, but entire divisions dropping simultaneously seemed beyond credible military reality. As additional reports continued arriving from multiple sectors, each describing large-scale paratrooper landings and glider assaults, Marx faced a command crisis that exposed the fundamental weakness of German defensive planning. His communication network had been designed to coordinate responses to predictable threats advancing along known routes. The sudden appearance of Allied forces throughout his entire area of responsibility overwhelmed systems built for sequential, localized engagements. The psychological pressure on German field commanders intensified as they realized the scope of their predicament. Colonel Friedrich von der Heide, commanding the 6th Parachute Regiment, found his own positions under attack by British airborne forces who seemed to know the terrain better than his own men. Radio communications crackled with desperate calls for reinforcements, ammunition, and clear orders from headquarters that seemed as confused as frontline units. Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized rapid, decisive action to defeat enemy operations before they could develop momentum. But when Allied forces appeared simultaneously at dozens of locations across a broad front, German commanders faced impossible choices about priority allocation. Every objective seemed critical: bridges that had to be held, artillery positions under assault, communication centers being overrun, yet available reserves could respond to only a fraction of the emerging threats. The command structure that had functioned efficiently during the conquest of Western Europe in 1940 proved inadequate for coordinating responses to this fundamentally different type of warfare. German generals had excelled at directing concentrated attacks along predictable axes of advance, supported by clear intelligence about enemy positions and intentions. The Allied airborne assault inverted this familiar pattern, forcing defenders to react to threats that materialized without warning throughout their rear areas. Senior Wehrmacht officers found themselves questioning basic assumptions about military operations that had guided their entire careers. Field Marshal Gerhard von Rundstedt, commanding all German forces in Western Europe, had built his reputation on methodical defensive planning based on predictable enemy behavior. The overnight appearance of 3 Allied divisions behind his coastal fortifications challenged every principle of warfare he had learned during 4 decades of military service. The fog of war that typically characterized major military operations became an impenetrable darkness when German commanders couldn't determine which reports represented genuine threats versus diversionary actions. Was the British airborne assault east of the Orne River the main Allied effort, or were the American landings around Sainte-Mère-Église more significant? Should available reserves concentrate against the largest enemy force or spread out to prevent smaller Allied units from achieving their individual objectives? German unit commanders facing immediate combat had no time for strategic analysis as they struggled to survive contact with enemy forces who seemed to possess supernatural knowledge of local terrain and defensive positions. British paratroopers attacked German strongpoints from directions that should have been impossible, while American glider troops seized objectives that Wehrmacht planners had considered secure due to their inland locations. The breakdown of normal command and control relationships left many German officers feeling isolated and desperate as they watched carefully prepared defensive plans collapse under the weight of an enemy operation unlike anything in their military experience. Phone calls to higher headquarters brought only additional confusion as staff officers struggled to compile coherent situation reports from fragmentary and contradictory field accounts. This human crisis of leadership and communication would only deepen as dawn approached and German commanders realized that the airborne assault was merely the prelude to an even larger seaborne invasion that would test their remaining capabilities beyond all reasonable limits. As dawn broke over Normandy on June 6, 1944, the true magnitude of the Allied operation became horrifyingly clear to German commanders who had spent the night trying to make sense of fragmentary reports and impossible battlefield developments. The first 12 hours of Operation Neptune revealed not just tactical surprise, but a complete revolution in the nature of warfare that left experienced Wehrmacht officers questioning everything they thought they understood about military operations. At 5:30 hours, as the eastern horizon began to lighten, German observation posts along the Norman coast reported a sight that defied imagination. The English Channel filled with ships from horizon to horizon. Over 5,000 Allied vessels, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports, and landing craft, were approaching the beaches in the largest armada ever assembled. But for German defenders already reeling from the overnight airborne assault, this seaborne force represented not just an invasion, but the final piece of an operational puzzle that revealed the full scope of Allied capabilities. General Erich Marx, still struggling to coordinate responses to paratrooper landings throughout his sector, now faced the additional nightmare of simultaneous amphibious assaults across multiple beaches. His available reserves had been committed piecemeal during the night, responding to airborne threats that seemed to materialize everywhere at once. The careful defensive plans that had taken months to prepare were unraveling as his forces found themselves fighting in all directions against enemies who had appeared behind, beside, and now in front of their positions. The systematic nature of the Allied assault became increasingly apparent as German commanders received reports from across the invasion front. This was not a desperate gamble or limited operation, but a carefully orchestrated campaign that demonstrated industrial and military capabilities far beyond previous Allied efforts. The overnight deployment of 3 airborne divisions had been perfectly timed to disrupt German communications and seize key objectives just as seaborne forces hit the beaches with unprecedented naval gunfire support. Wehrmacht doctrine had always emphasized the importance of rapid counterattack to defeat enemy forces before they could consolidate their positions. But the Allied operation had been specifically designed to prevent such responses. Paratroopers seized key bridges, crossroads, and communication centers that German reinforcements needed to reach the invasion beaches. Glider-borne troops captured artillery positions that should have provided devastating fire against landing craft. Simultaneously, Allied naval bombardment and air attacks targeted any remaining German forces attempting to move toward the threatened sectors. The psychological impact on German commanders was devastating as they realized their entire defensive strategy had been based on fundamentally flawed assumptions. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had positioned his strongest forces near the most likely invasion beaches, confident that German defenders could defeat any amphibious assault during its most vulnerable phase. The overnight airborne operations had bypassed this carefully constructed defensive system entirely, landing Allied forces behind coastal fortifications and creating chaos in the German rear areas just as seaborne troops began fighting their way ashore. Radio communications crackled with increasingly desperate reports as German unit commanders described situations that seemed impossible according to conventional military logic. British paratroopers were holding bridges that should have been destroyed hours earlier. American glider troops had captured German artillery positions that were supposed to be providing fire support against the beach landings. Allied forces seemed to possess detailed knowledge of German defensive plans, striking at precisely the points where Wehrmacht doctrine was most vulnerable. The speed of Allied operations also negated many traditional German advantages. Wehrmacht forces had excelled during the conquest of Western Europe by maintaining operational tempo that prevented enemies from organizing effective responses. Now the roles were reversed, with Allied forces operating at a pace that left German defenders struggling to understand what was happening, much less coordinate effective countermeasures. By mid-morning, as reports continued pouring in from across Normandy, the full scope of the Allied achievement became undeniable. This was not merely a large-scale invasion, but a demonstration of military capabilities that represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power. The successful overnight deployment of 3 airborne divisions followed by simultaneous amphibious assaults supported by overwhelming naval and air power revealed that the Allies possessed the resources, technology, and organizational skill to conduct operations on a scale that the German war machine could no longer match. For Wehrmacht officers who had built their careers on the assumption of German military superiority, this realization was profoundly shocking. The invasion of Normandy was succeeding not through superior courage or tactical brilliance, but through the systematic application of industrial and technological advantages that Germany could no longer contest. The overnight appearance of Allied armies behind German lines had announced the arrival of a new form of warfare that made traditional defensive strategies obsolete. The moment of ultimate crisis for German command came at approximately 10:15 hours on June 6, when Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's staff car raced along the dusty roads leading back from Germany toward his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon. The Desert Fox had been visiting his wife for her birthday, confident that the rough weather conditions made Allied invasion impossible for several more days. Now, as radio reports crackled through his mobile communications unit, Rommel faced the professional nightmare that had haunted him since taking command of Army Group B. The Allies had achieved complete tactical surprise during his absence from the front. The reports reaching Rommel's racing convoy painted a picture of military disaster unfolding across his entire command sector. British airborne forces had seized intact the critical bridges over the Caen Canal and Orne River, objectives that Rommel had personally inspected just weeks earlier. American paratroopers were holding key positions throughout the Cotentin Peninsula, while glider-borne troops had captured German artillery batteries that should have been devastating the invasion beaches. Most shocking of all, Allied seaborne forces were successfully establishing beachheads along a 50-mile front despite months of careful German defensive preparations. Upon reaching his command post, Rommel immediately placed urgent calls to Wehrmacht High Command in Berlin, but found himself struggling to explain a military situation that seemed to violate every principle of warfare he had learned during his distinguished career. How could he report that 3 entire Allied divisions had appeared overnight behind his defensive lines without triggering any effective German response? How could he admit that the Atlantic Wall, which Hitler had proclaimed impregnable, was being systematically overcome by an enemy operation of unprecedented scale and coordination? The conversations between Rommel and his superiors in Berlin revealed the growing panic within German high command as the implications of the Allied success became clear. This was not a limited operation that could be contained through conventional defensive measures, but a fundamental challenge to German military doctrine that exposed critical weaknesses in Wehrmacht strategic thinking. The overnight deployment of Allied airborne forces had demonstrated capabilities that German planners had considered impossible, while the simultaneous success of seaborne landings revealed the obsolescence of coastal fortifications. Adages. General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief military advisor, initially received Rommel's reports with skepticism born of institutional arrogance. The German high command had convinced itself that Allied forces lacked the capability for operations on such a massive scale, and that Wehrmacht defensive preparations were adequate to defeat any invasion attempt. But as additional reports continued arriving from multiple sectors, each confirming the scope of Allied success, even the most confident Nazi leaders began to grasp the magnitude of their miscalculation. The first desperate suggestions of negotiated settlement emerged during these chaotic morning hours, as German field commanders realized they were facing military capabilities that their forces could not effectively counter. Colonel Friedrich von der Heide, whose parachute regiment was being systematically overwhelmed by British airborne forces, transmitted increasingly frantic requests for permission to withdraw from positions that had become untenable. His communications revealed the growing desperation of experienced Wehrmacht officers who understood that continuing resistance might result in the complete destruction of their commands. Similar calls for negotiation or strategic withdrawal were reaching German headquarters from commanders across the invasion front. General Wilhelm Falle, commanding the 91st Air Landing Division, had been killed while attempting to reach his command post, leaving his forces leaderless and increasingly desperate. The 352nd Infantry Division, positioned to defend Omaha Beach, was reporting devastating casualties from naval bombardment that exceeded anything experienced during previous Allied landings. Throughout Normandy, German officers were discovering that their carefully prepared defensive positions were being neutralized by Allied tactical innovations they had never encountered before. The psychological impact on German leadership extended far beyond immediate tactical concerns. The successful Allied operation represented a demonstration of military-industrial capabilities that revealed the true balance of power in the European war. Germany's ability to continue effective resistance depended on maintaining defensive advantages that could offset Allied superiority in resources and technology. The overnight deployment of 3 airborne divisions, supported by the largest seaborne invasion in history, proved that such advantages no longer existed. By noon on June 6th, as Allied forces continued expanding their beachheads and linking up with airborne units, the scope of German defeat was becoming undeniable. Wehrmacht commanders who had spent years fighting successful defensive campaigns against numerically superior enemies now faced opponents who possessed not just greater numbers, but revolutionary tactical capabilities that made traditional defensive strategies ineffective. The desperate calls to Berlin for permission to negotiate reflected this growing recognition that continued resistance might be militarily futile. The transformation of confident German defend into desperate men pleading for negotiated settlement had occurred in less than 12 hours, marking one of the most dramatic reversals of military fortune in modern warfare history. The collapse of German defensive strategy in Normandy unfolded with devastating speed during the days following June 6th, as Wehrmacht commanders discovered that the successful Allied airborne assault had fundamentally altered the strategic balance in Western Europe. The overnight deployment of 3 entire divisions behind German lines had not merely achieved tactical surprise, it had demonstrated Allied capabilities that made continued German resistance increasingly futile. Within 48 hours of the initial landings, German casualty reports painted a picture of military disaster that exceeded even the most pessimistic Wehrmacht projections. The 21st Panzer Division, positioned to counterattack any Allied beachhead, had lost over half its tanks attempting to dislodge British airborne forces from positions that should have been easily overrun. The 352nd Infantry Division, defending Omaha Beach, was reporting unit strengths reduced to company-level effectiveness after sustained naval bombardment and infantry assault. Throughout Normandy, German formations that had taken months to organize and equip were being systematically destroyed in piecemeal counterattacks against Allied forces that seemed to possess unlimited reserves and firepower. The human cost of continued resistance became increasingly apparent as German field hospitals overflowed with casualties from encounters with Allied forces whose tactical advantages had proven overwhelming. Young Wehrmacht soldiers who had been confident in their defensive preparations just days earlier now spoke in hushed tones about enemies who appeared from the sky without warning and possessed weapons capabilities that seemed almost supernatural. The psychological impact of facing opponents who could deploy entire armies overnight had shattered German morale in ways that no amount of Nazi propaganda could repair. German logistics networks, already strained by years of war on multiple fronts, proved completely inadequate for sustaining operations against Allied forces whose supply capabilities defied previous military experience. The successful airborne seizure of key bridges, crossroads, and communication centers had disrupted Wehrmacht's supply lines just as German forces needed massive amounts of ammunition and reinforcements to contain the invasion. Units that ran out of anti-tank rounds found themselves as helpless against Allied armor that seemed to multiply hourly as seaborne reinforcements poured ashore. The systematic destruction of German communication networks by Allied airborne forces had created a command crisis that paralyzed Wehrmacht responses throughout the critical first week of the invasion. Field commanders found themselves cut off from higher headquarters, unable to coordinate effective counterattacks or even report their actual situations to superiors in Berlin. The careful defensive plans that had taken months to develop became useless documents as German officers struggled to maintain contact with their own subordinate units while under constant attack from enemies who seemed to possess perfect intelligence about Wehrmacht positions and capabilities. More fundamentally, the success of Operation Neptune had revealed that German military doctrine was obsolete in the face of Allied technological and industrial superiority. The Wehrmacht had excelled at rapid, concentrated attacks that achieved decisive results before enemies could organize effective responses. But the Allied operation had inverted this formula, achieving such overwhelming tactical surprise and operational scale that German forces found themselves reacting to threats they couldn't adequately counter or even fully comprehend. The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation in Normandy. If the Allies could successfully deploy 3 entire divisions overnight in a single operation, what prevented them from conducting similar assaults elsewhere along the Atlantic Wall? German commanders responsible for coastal defense from Norway to Spain suddenly found themselves questioning whether their own positions could withstand attacks of similar scale and sophistication. The psychological advantage that had sustained German defensive confidence for 4 years was evaporating as Wehrmacht officers realized their opponents possessed capabilities that made traditional defensive strategies ineffective. The growing desperation among German field commanders manifested most clearly in their increasingly frantic communications with Berlin during the week following D-Day, as experienced Wehrmacht officers found themselves pleading for permission to abandon defensive positions that had become death traps. The overnight success of Allied airborne operations had not merely created tactical problems, it had exposed fundamental flaws in German strategic thinking that made continued resistance appear suicidal rather than heroic. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding all German forces in Western Europe, found himself in the impossible pose. Idea of trying to explain to Hitler why the most elaborately fortified defensive line in military history was being systematically overcome by enemy forces whose capabilities had been consistently underestimated by Nazi leadership. His telephone conversations with Wehrmacht High Command revealed the growing gulf between German political leadership, which continued to demand fanatical resistance, and military commanders who understood that they were facing opponents whose technological and organizational advantages made victory impossible. The reports reaching Berlin from multiple commanders across Normandy painted a consistent picture of military capabilities that German forces could not effectively counter. General Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg, commanding Panzer Group West, described Allied air superiority so complete that German armored movements during daylight hours resulted in immediate and devastating attacks from fighter bombers that seemed to appear without warning. His panzer divisions, which represented Germany's most potent remaining offensive capability, were being reduced to scrap metal faster than they could engage Allied ground forces. Colonel Kurt Meyer, commanding the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, transmitted increasingly desperate requests for reinforcements and air support that Wehrmacht headquarters could not provide. His elite formation, composed of fanatical young volunteers who had been expected to spearhead German counterattacks, was being systematically destroyed by Allied forces whose firepower advantages seemed to multiply daily. The psychological impact on these supposedly elite troops was devastating as they discovered that their training and ideological commitment meant nothing against enemies who possessed overwhelming material superiority. The collapse of German defensive positions accelerated as Allied forces linked up their airborne and seaborne elements, creating continuous front lines that Wehrmacht forces could no longer effectively contest. British paratroopers who had seized bridges during the overnight assault were being reinforced by armored units advancing from the invasion beaches, while American airborne forces in the Cotentin Peninsula were receiving heavy weapons and supplies that transformed isolated paratrooper positions into permanent defensive strongpoints. By June 12th, exactly 1 week after the initial invasion, German casualties in Normandy exceeded 25,000 men, including thousands of experienced officers and NCOs whose loss could not be replaced. These were not the elderly reservists and foreign volunteers who comprised much of Germany's coastal garrison forces, but veteran soldiers from elite formations who represented the Wehrmacht's remaining combat effectiveness. Their destruction and futile counterattacks against Allied positions that grew stronger daily revealed the complete bankruptcy of German defensive strategy. The requests for negotiated settlement became more explicit as German commanders realized that continued resistance would result in the complete annihilation of their forces without achieving any meaningful military objectives. General Friedrich Dollmann, commanding the 7th Army, transmitted coded messages suggesting that Wehrmacht forces might consider local surrender agreements if Berlin would authorize negotiations with Allied commanders. Similar suggestions emerged from other German officers who understood that their tactical situation was hopeless and that continued fighting served no purpose beyond satisfying Nazi political demands for fanatical resistance. The transformation of the German High Command's attitude toward the war became evident in previously classified communications that revealed growing recognition among Wehrmacht leadership that the Allied success in Normandy represented more than a temporary setback. The overnight deployment of 3 airborne divisions had demonstrated capabilities that suggested the Allies possessed the resources and organizational skill to conduct similar operations wherever they chose. For German commanders responsible for defending thousands of miles of coastline with increasingly inadequate forces, this realization was profoundly demoralizing. The desperate calls for peace negotiations reflected not just immediate tactical concerns, but a growing understanding among experienced German officers that their nation's military situation had become fundamentally untenable. The Allied achievement in landing entire armies overnight had announced the arrival of a new form of warfare that Germany could neither match nor effectively counter. The successful overnight deployment of 3 Allied airborne divisions during Operation Neptune marked more than just a tactical victory. It represented a fundamental transformation in the nature of warfare that rendered traditional military thinking obsolete. The German officers who found themselves pleading with Berlin for permission to negotiate had witnessed the dawn of modern combined arms operations, where technological superiority and industrial capacity could overcome any defensive advantage that geography or fortification might provide. The psychological impact of this achievement extended far beyond the immediate battlefield results. For centuries, military commanders had operated under the assumption that armies moved at predictable speeds along known routes toward visible objectives. The overnight appearance of 24,000 Allied troops behind German lines violated every principle of warfare that had guided military planning since ancient times. The shock experienced by Wehrmacht officers was not merely tactical surprise, but a fundamental challenge to their understanding of what was militarily possible. The Allied success in Normandy demonstrated that modern warfare had evolved beyond the reach of nations that could not match the industrial and technological capabilities required for operations of such unprecedented scale and complexity. Germany's military machine, which had conquered most of Europe through superior organization and tactical innovation, found itself confronted by opponents whose advantages were so overwhelming that continued resistance became meaningless. The desperate German calls for negotiation reflected a deeper truth about the changing nature of international conflict. The age of warfare determined by superior generalship, tactical brilliance, or soldier courage was ending, replaced by contests of industrial capacity and technological sophistication that only the most advanced nations could sustain. The overnight deployment of entire armies announced that warfare had entered a new era where traditional military virtues counted for less than productive capacity and scientific advancement. This transformation would define military thinking for generations to come, establishing principles of combined arms operations and technological superiority that continue to shape modern warfare. The German officers who begged Berlin to negotiate after witnessing Allied capabilities they could not comprehend had encountered the future of military conflict, a future that their nation's resources and industrial base could no longer compete with effectively.